The champagne flutes were crystal, the string quartet was flawless, and the engagement ring on Rachel Williams' finger caught every ray of the Texas sunset streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Riverside Country Club. Everything was picture-perfect for David's proposal celebration, except for the moment my 8-year-old son Jake tugged on my dress and asked in his clear, innocent voice that carried across the entire terrace, "Mommy, why didn't you come home with us tonight?" The music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. And Rachel's radiant smile cracked like thin ice as every single person at that party turned to stare at the child who had just shattered the beautiful illusion they'd all been celebrating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and that question from my son would become the single moment that unraveled everything David and Rachel had built together. But to understand why those 8 words had such devastating power, you need to know how I ended up standing in that country club in the first place, watching my ex-husband celebrate his engagement to the woman who had been slowly erasing me from my own child's life. 3 years ago, David and I divorced after what everyone called an amicable split. We'd grown apart, wanted different things, fell out of love the way couples sometimes do without any dramatic betrayals or screaming matches. We agreed to share custody of Jake 50-50, keep things civil for his sake, and move forward as co-parents. I thought we were doing everything right. I thought we were protecting our son from the ugliness that divorce could bring. I was naive enough to believe that doing the right thing would somehow shield me from having my heart methodically carved out of my chest. The first sign something was wrong came 6 months after our divorce was finalized. Jake started mentioning Rachel during our weeks together. At first, it was innocent. Daddy's friend Rachel helped me with homework. Rachel made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Rachel knows all the words to every Disney song. I smiled and nodded because I wanted Jake to feel comfortable with whoever David was dating. I wanted to be the mature ex-wife who put her child's happiness above petty jealousy. Then the mentions became more frequent and more specific. Rachel reads bedtime stories in funny voices. Rachel taught me how to tie my shoes the fast way. Rachel and Daddy are teaching me how to cook grilled cheese. Still, I pushed down the uncomfortable feeling growing in my stomach. David was allowed to have a girlfriend. Jake was allowed to like her. This was what healthy co-parenting looked like, right? The shift happened so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. Jake started asking if Rachel could come to his soccer games during my weekends. He mentioned that Rachel said this or Rachel thinks that about everything from his schoolwork to his choice of breakfast cereal. When I planned special activities for our time together, Jake would compare them to things he did with Rachel and Daddy. The 3 of them had become a unit, and slowly but surely, I was becoming the outsider looking in at my own child's life. But the real wake-up call came 8 months ago, when Jake started school at Westfield Elementary. I showed up for the parent-teacher conference I had scheduled, only to find David and Rachel already sitting in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, discussing Jake's progress like they were his biological parents. Mrs. Patterson looked confused when I introduced myself as Jake's mother, and I realized with a sick feeling that Rachel had been handling all of Jake's school interactions. She knew his teachers, his friends, his academic struggles and triumphs. She was living my life while I was relegated to weekend visits and summer vacations. That night, I called David and asked him to meet me for coffee. I kept my voice calm and reasonable, as I explained that I felt like I was being pushed out of Jake's daily life. David listened with that patient expression he used to wear when I complained about his long work hours. And then he delivered the blow that should have prepared me for what was coming. "Sarah," he said, "Rachel isn't trying to replace you. But Jake spends more time at our house than yours, because our schedule is more stable. Rachel is there when he gets home from school. She helps with homework and dinner and bedtime routines. You see him every other weekend and 1 weeknight a month. Of course he's going to bond with the person who's actually raising him day to day." The words hit me like a physical slap. I wanted to argue to point out that I had requested 50-50 custody, and that David had been the one to suggest the current arrangement because it would be less disruptive for Jake. I wanted to remind him that I had moved to a smaller apartment closer to Jake's school specifically, so I could be more involved in his daily life. But instead I sat there nodding like his logic made perfect sense. Because I had spent 2 years training myself to be the agreeable ex-wife who never caused problems. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was believing that being understanding and flexible would somehow earn me respect and consideration from the people who were systematically writing me out of my own child's story. The engagement announcement came through a text message from David, with a photo attached. The picture showed him on one knee in our old backyard, the one I had spent countless weekends landscaping and nurturing, proposing to Rachel while Jake stood nearby holding a sign that read, "Will you be my new mommy?" My hands shook as I stared at that image, not because I still loved David, but because I realized that my son had participated in a moment that symbolically replaced me before I even knew it was happening. I called David immediately, my voice tight with controlled emotion. "You let Jake be part of the proposal?" I asked. "Sarah, he wanted to be involved," David replied, his tone defensive. "This is a big change for all of us, and we thought it would help him feel included in the process." I wanted to scream that Jake shouldn't have to feel included in the process of getting a new mother because he already had one, but instead I heard myself saying congratulations and asking about wedding plans like I was just another family friend receiving good news. The wedding was scheduled for the following spring, but first, there would be an engagement party. A celebration of their love and their future as a family. David called me 2 weeks before the event to discuss the arrangements. "We're having the party at the Riverside Country Club," he said. "Obviously Jake will be there, and since it's your weekend with him, we were hoping you'd drop him off around 4 and pick him up after the party ends." I agreed, because that's what I always did. I agreed because I had convinced myself that being the cooperative ex-wife was more important than standing up for my own dignity. I agreed because I thought that somewhere in David's mind, there was still enough respect for our shared history and our child to ensure I wouldn't be completely erased from Jake's life. I was wrong about that too. The day of the engagement party, I spent an hour getting Jake ready. He was excited about wearing his little suit and tie, chattering about how pretty Rachel would look and how there would be cake and dancing. As I drove him to the country club, he asked if I wanted to see Rachel's dress, if I thought she would like the drawing he made for her, if I knew that she and Daddy were going to have a big wedding where he got to carry the rings. Each innocent question felt like a small knife twist, but I smiled and answered enthusiastically because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy, even if his happiness seemed to require my absence. When we arrived at the country club, Jake surprised me by grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the entrance. "Come on, Mommy," he said. "I want to show you where we're going to sit and meet Rachel's family." I tried to explain that this was Daddy's party and I was just dropping him off, but Jake's face fell in that particular way that made my chest ache. "But you're my mommy," he said. "Don't you want to see the party?" Before I could respond, David appeared in the lobby, looking handsome in his navy suit, and slightly panicked at seeing me inside the venue instead of in the car where he'd expected me to stay. "Sarah," he said, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jake immediately ran to his father and started explaining that he wanted me to see the decorations and meet everyone. David's eyes met mine over Jake's head, and I saw something flicker there, some mixture of guilt and annoyance that made my decision for me. "I'd love to see the party for just a few minutes," I said, matching his forced smile with one of my own. "If that's okay." David couldn't say no without looking like a complete villain in front of our son, so he nodded stiffly and gestured toward the main event space. The party was beautiful in the way that expensive events always are. White roses and golden accents everywhere. A champagne fountain that sparkled in the late afternoon light. Round tables set with crisp linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Jake immediately ran off to find the dessert table, leaving David and me standing awkwardly near the entrance as guests began to notice my presence. I recognized most of the faces from our shared past. David's college friends, his co-workers, both sets of our parents, my own brother Mike, who avoided eye contact when he saw me. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, holding champagne glasses and wearing the kind of forced smiles people wear when they're not sure if they're witnessing a social disaster in real time. Rachel appeared at David's side like she had materialized from thin air, stunning, in a flowing cream-colored dress that managed to look bridal without being white. She was everything I wasn't. Tall where I was average height, blonde where I was brunette, effortlessly elegant where I always felt like I was trying too hard. Her smile when she saw me was perfect and cold as winter morning. "Sarah," she said, extending a manicured hand. "What a lovely surprise. I'm so glad you could join us." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words were gracious, but her eyes were calculating. She had been planning this moment, I realized, deciding exactly how she would handle my unexpected presence at her celebration. "Congratulations," I managed, shaking her hand and feeling like I was participating in some elaborate theater performance where everyone knew their lines except me. "Everything looks beautiful." And it did look beautiful. It looked like the kind of engagement party I had always imagined having someday, back when I thought David and I would grow old together and celebrate milestone anniversaries with parties exactly like this one. Jake returned with a plate full of fancy appetizers, chattering excitedly about the ice sculpture and the man playing violin near the windows. He grabbed my hand and Rachel's hand at the same time, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, and announced that he wanted to show us both the view from the terrace. We followed him outside, where the Texas sunset was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would make perfect backgrounds for engagement photos. Other guests had spilled onto the terrace as well, and I found myself standing in a small circle with David, Rachel, and Jake, while conversations swirled around us. That's when Rachel's sister Kelly approached with her phone already recording. "We have to get some pictures of the happy family," she announced, gesturing for David and Rachel to move closer together. "This is such a special moment." She snapped several photos of the engaged couple with Jake between them, and then, whether from genuine thoughtlessness or calculated cruelty, she looked at me and said, "Sarah, would you mind taking a few pictures of the three of them together? I want to make sure we get some good shots for the wedding album." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone within earshot had stopped their own conversations to watch this little drama unfold. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the anticipation of how I would react to being asked to photograph my replacement family. The smart thing would have been to politely decline and excuse myself from the party. The dignified thing would have been to smile graciously and make some excuse about needing to leave. Instead, I took the phone and spent the next 5 minutes taking pictures of my ex-husband, his fiancée, and our son, looking like the perfect family I had never managed to give Jake. I watched through the camera lens as Rachel rested her hand on Jake's shoulder with the easy familiarity of someone who tucked him into bed every night. I captured David's proud smile as he looked down at the woman who would become Jake's stepmother, the woman who already knew his teachers and his friends and his bedtime routine better than I did. When I handed the phone back to Kelly, she scrolled through the images with obvious satisfaction. "These are perfect," she said. "Jake is so lucky to have such a wonderful new family." Then she looked at me with what might have been sympathy, or might have been pity, and added, "It must be so nice for you to see how happy he is." That's when it happened. That's when my sweet, innocent 8-year-old son, who had been listening to this entire exchange with the careful attention children pay to adult conversations they don't quite understand, looked up at me with his father's dark eyes and asked the question that would change everything. "Mommy," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the terrace in that way children's voices do when they're confused and seeking clarification, "why didn't you come home with us tonight? Rachel says I can stay up late for the party, and Daddy says we're going to have pancakes for breakfast tomorrow. Don't you want to come home and have pancakes with us?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's question hung in the evening air like a physical presence, and I felt every person on that terrace stop breathing as they absorbed what he had just said. My son, my beautiful, innocent son, didn't understand why I wouldn't be coming home with them because, in his 8-year-old mind, Rachel was becoming his new mother. But that didn't mean his old mother should disappear. Rachel's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. David looked like he had been struck by lightning. The guests closest to us began whispering frantically among themselves, and I saw my parents across the terrace exchange a look of profound sadness and understanding. But it was Jake's expectant face that broke my heart into a million irreparable pieces. He was waiting for an answer to a question that shouldn't have existed. He was asking why his mother wasn't part of his family anymore, and he was asking it in front of 50 people who had been complicit in erasing me from his life. I knelt down to Jake's eye level, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Baby," I said, "Mommy has her own home now, remember? We talked about how Mommy and Daddy live in different houses now." But Jake shook his head with the stubborn logic of a child who knows when adults aren't making sense. "But Rachel lives at our house now," he said, "and she's gonna be my new mommy, so why can't I have two mommies at the same house? Tommy at school has two daddies, and they all live together." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly. I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," from somewhere behind me. Rachel made a small, strangled sound that might have been a sob or might have been panic. And David, my ex-husband, who had spent 2 years carefully orchestrating my removal from my son's daily life, stood frozen like a man watching his perfect world crumble in real time. Because Jake, in his innocent honesty, had just revealed the truth, that all the polite fiction and careful arrangements had been designed to hide. He saw Rachel as his new mother, but he still wanted his real mother too. He didn't understand why loving Rachel meant losing me, and his confusion was now public knowledge at Rachel's engagement party. I stood up slowly, my eyes meeting Rachel's across the small space that separated us. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked human instead of perfect. She looked terrified and young, and completely unprepared for the reality that claiming my role in Jake's life meant answering questions about why his actual mother had been pushed aside. The party was still happening around us. The string quartet was still playing. The champagne fountain was still sparkling. But everything had changed in the space of one 8-year-old's innocent question, and there was no taking it back. The moments that followed Jake's question stretched like elastic about to snap. I watched Rachel's carefully composed expression crumble as the weight of what had just happened settled over the terrace like a heavy blanket. Her engagement ring caught the last rays of sunlight as her hand trembled slightly, and I realized that for all her planning and positioning, she had never prepared for this moment when the child at the center of her new family would expose the uncomfortable truth about how that family had been constructed. David recovered first, the way he always did in crisis situations. He reached for Jake's hand with that practiced parental smile that said everything was normal even when it wasn't. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice artificially cheerful. "Remember how we talked about this? Mommy Sarah has her own special place now, and Rachel is going to be your bonus mom. That's even better than having two moms in the same house because you get twice as much love." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach as I listened to David's explanation. Bonus mom. As if I were the original that could be supplemented rather than replaced. As if my relationship with my son was something that could be divided and redistributed according to David's convenience. Jake looked confused by this explanation, his 8-year-old brain trying to process why having two moms who loved him couldn't possibly mean they could all live together and be happy. Rachel finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more fragile than the confident tone she usually employed. "Jake, sweetie," she said, kneeling down to his level the way I had moments before. "Families come in all different shapes and sizes. You're so lucky because you have your mommy Sarah who loves you very much, and now you're getting me too. We're all going to work together to make sure you're happy and loved." The words were perfect and diplomatic and completely inadequate for explaining to a child why the adults in his life had created a situation where his happiness required his mother's exile. Jake nodded like he understood, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way they did when he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite make sense. The other guests had begun to drift away from our little circle, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people processed what they had witnessed. But I caught fragments of whispered comments as they moved past us. "That poor child. How awkward for everyone involved. I can't believe she showed up here. Someone should have prepared him better for this." My brother Mike appeared at my elbow, his face flushed with embarrassment, and something that might have been anger. "Sarah," he said quietly, "maybe we should go." This isn't the place for family drama." His words stung because they carried the implication that I was the one creating drama simply by existing in the same space as my ex-husband and his new fiancée. As if my presence at a party where my son was a guest of honor was somehow inappropriate. But before I could respond, my mother materialized on my other side. Linda Mitchell had been quietly observing from across the terrace, and the expression on her face was unlike anything I had seen from her in the past 2 years of carefully neutral comments about my divorce and David's new relationship. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for David and Rachel to hear, "I think this is exactly the place for honesty. That little boy just asked a perfectly reasonable question, and he deserves a real answer." The tension on the terrace ratcheted up another notch as my mother inserted herself into the situation. David's parents, Tom and Susan Chen, had been hovering nearby with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they had been anticipating some kind of confrontation all evening. Now they approached our group with determined smiles that fooled no one. "Linda," Susan said warmly, extending her arms toward my mother as if they were still the close friends they had been when David and I were married. "How wonderful to see you. Isn't this just the most beautiful celebration? Rachel has done such an amazing job planning everything." My mother accepted Susan's embrace with polite coolness, then stepped back and fixed her with the kind of look that had made me confess to breaking household rules when I was Jake's age. "It is beautiful," she agreed. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised that no one thought to prepare Jake for the questions he might have about family arrangements during such a public event." The comment landed like a small bomb in the middle of our increasingly tense circle. Rachel's face flushed pink, and David's jaw tightened in the way that meant he was struggling to maintain his composure. Tom Chen cleared his throat uncomfortably and tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Well," he said with forced joviality, "the important thing is that Jake is happy and loved, and that's certainly the case here. David and Rachel have created such a wonderful home for him, and we're all just thrilled about this next chapter in their lives." My father, Robert Mitchell, had joined us by this point, and I watched his expression harden as he absorbed Tom's words. Dad had been largely silent during the 2 years since my divorce, supporting my decisions without commentary and maintaining cordial relationships with David and his family. But something about this moment, about watching his grandson navigate adult complexities that should never have been his burden, seemed to strip away his diplomatic restraint. "A wonderful home," he repeated slowly, his voice carrying a tone I rarely heard from my mild-mannered father. "I'm curious, Tom, about how you define wonderful. Is it wonderful when a child asks why his mother can't come home with him? Is it wonderful when an 8-year-old has to figure out family dynamics that the adults around him haven't bothered to explain properly?" The silence that followed was painful and electric. Jake, sensing the tension among the adults but not understanding its source, pressed closer to my side and slipped his small hand into mine. The gesture was automatic and unconscious, the way children seek comfort from their mothers when the world feels uncertain, and I saw Rachel notice it with something that looked like genuine pain crossing her features. "Mr. Mitchell," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of the situation, "I want you to know that I've never tried to replace Sarah in Jake's life. I love him very much, and I want what's best for him, which includes having a strong relationship with his mother." The words were gracious and probably sincere, but they hung in the air with a hollow quality that everyone present could feel. Because regardless of Rachel's intentions, the reality was that Jake spent most of his time in a house where she tucked him in at night, helped with his homework, and participated in the daily rhythms of his life, while I got scheduled visits and carefully planned activities. My mother, never one to let diplomatic language mask uncomfortable truths, seized on Rachel's statement with the precision of a surgeon. "That's lovely to hear, Rachel," she said. "I'm sure Sarah would be interested to know more about how you plan to ensure Jake maintains that strong relationship with his mother. Perhaps you could share some specifics about how you see that working, given the current arrangements." David stepped forward then, his face tight with the kind of controlled anger that meant he was about to say something he might regret. "Linda, with all due respect, the arrangements we have in place are working well for everyone involved. Jake is thriving, and Sarah sees him regularly. We don't need to rehash custody details at an engagement party. Clearly the arrangements aren't working for everyone, my father interjected, his voice quiet but carrying enough steel to make everyone within earshot take notice. My grandson just asked his mother why she can't come home with him tonight. That suggests there might be some confusion that needs addressing. Emma Rodriguez, my best friend since college, had been watching this entire exchange from near the bar, and she chose this moment to join our increasingly crowded family conference. Emma had never particularly liked David, even during our marriage, and she had been vocal in private about her concerns regarding how my relationship with Jake was being managed post-divorce. Her arrival added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. "Sarah?" she said, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. "I thought you might need this." She handed me a drink, then turned to face the assembled group with the kind of smile that looked friendly but carried undertones of challenge. What a beautiful party. Though I have to admit I'm a little confused about the seating arrangements. I noticed there wasn't a place card for Sarah anywhere. Is she not staying for dinner? The question was perfectly innocent in its phrasing and absolutely devastating in its implications. Because of course there was no place card for me, I hadn't been invited to stay for dinner. I had been expected to deliver Jake to the party like a package, and disappear until it was time for pickup. The fact that Emma had pointed this out in front of both sets of parents and the engaged couple made the deliberate exclusion impossible to ignore. Rachel's sister Kelly, who had been the one to ask me to take photos earlier, suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable as she realized her earlier request had taken on new significance. She had asked the uninvited ex-wife to photograph the new family, highlighting the very dynamic that Jake's innocent question had just exposed to everyone present. "Well," David said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining social niceties, while his perfect engagement party devolved into a family therapy session. "We didn't want to assume Sarah would want to stay for the dinner portion. We thought she might prefer to pick Jake up afterward." Emma's laugh was light and musical, and completely without humor. "Oh, you didn't want to assume. How thoughtful of you to spare Sarah the burden of being included in a celebration involving her son." She took a sip of her champagne and regarded David with the kind of pointed attention that made it clear she was just getting started. "Though I suppose it would be awkward to have the child's actual mother present while everyone toasts his new family configuration." The conversation was spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control it, and I could see panic beginning to creep into Rachel's carefully maintained composure. This was supposed to be her moment, her celebration, her introduction to David's extended family and friend group as his future wife and Jake's soon-to-be stepmother. Instead, it was becoming a public examination of the ethical implications of the family structure they had created. Jake, meanwhile, was watching this adult drama unfold, with the kind of intense focus children bring to situations they don't understand but sense are important. He hadn't let go of my hand, and I could feel his small fingers tightening around mine as the voices around us became more tense and pointed. "Mommy," he said quietly, tugging on my dress to get my attention. "Are you sad? You look like you look when you watch the sad movies." His question cut through all the adult posturing and diplomatic language, like a knife through silk. Because yes, I was sad. I was devastated, and furious and heartbroken, and trying desperately to hold it all together in front of 50 people who were watching me navigate the worst kind of public humiliation. My son could see it, even if the adults around him were too invested in their own narratives to acknowledge what was actually happening. I knelt down to Jake's level once again, aware that every word I said would be scrutinized and analyzed and potentially used against me later. "I'm okay, baby," I said, smoothing his dark hair away from his forehead. "Sometimes adults have complicated feelings about things, but that doesn't mean anything is wrong. I love you very much, and that's what matters most." Jake nodded solemnly, then looked around at all the adults surrounding us with their tense faces and rigid postures. "Can we all just be happy together?" he asked with the kind of innocent wisdom that only children possess. "I don't understand why everyone looks mad when we're supposed to be having a party." His words hung in the evening air like an accusation and a plea rolled into one. Here was this 8-year-old child, trying to understand why the adults in his life couldn't figure out how to coexist peacefully for the sake of his happiness. He wanted his mother, his father, and his soon-to-be stepmother to all get along, because in his mind, that would make his world complete and secure. But what Jake couldn't understand, what no one had bothered to explain to him, was that his desire for everyone to be happy together was fundamentally incompatible with the family structure that had been created around him. You couldn't systematically exclude someone from a child's life and then expect that child to understand why that person couldn't participate in family celebrations. You couldn't position yourself as a replacement mother and then be surprised when the child questioned why he needed a replacement at all. Rachel broke first under the weight of Jake's innocent question and the scrutiny of everyone present. Tears began sliding down her carefully made-up cheeks, and her voice shook when she spoke. "Jake, sweetheart, we all want you to be happy. That's all any of us want. But sometimes grown-up relationships are complicated, and we have to figure out the best way for everyone to be okay." "But Mommy isn't okay," Jake said with devastating clarity, looking directly at Rachel. "She looks sad, and she's not staying for dinner, and she doesn't live at our house anymore. How is that the best way?" The question hit Rachel like a physical blow. She looked at David with desperation in her eyes, silently pleading for him to step in and handle a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her ability to manage. But David was dealing with his own crisis as he realized that his son's very public questions were exposing the fundamental flaws in the narrative they had constructed about their blended family. Marcus Johnson, David's best friend and groomsman-to-be, appeared at David's shoulder with the kind of timing that suggested he had been monitoring the situation from a distance and decided intervention was necessary. "Hey," he said with forced casualness, "they're about to start serving dinner. Maybe we should all head inside and let Jake get some food before he gets too tired." It was a diplomatic attempt to defuse the situation, but Jake was not ready to be redirected. "I want Mommy to come to dinner too," he announced, his voice carrying the kind of determination that meant he was prepared to dig in on this point. "She's hungry too, and she should sit with us." The simple logic of a child who wanted his mother to share a meal with him became the final straw that broke the careful facade everyone had been maintaining. Because how do you explain to an 8-year-old that his mother can't stay for dinner at a party celebrating his father's engagement without acknowledging that she's being deliberately excluded? How do you maintain the fiction that everyone is happy with the current arrangements, when the child at the center of those arrangements is actively questioning why they exist? David looked around at the faces surrounding him. His own parents, my parents, his friends, Rachel's family, all of them waiting to see how he would handle his son's increasingly difficult questions. The perfect engagement party he had envisioned was crumbling around him, but more importantly, he was being forced to confront the reality that his choices had created confusion and pain for the child he claimed to be protecting. "Jake," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been regret, "Mommy has her own plans for tonight, but we'll see her again soon, okay? And right now, we need to let Rachel enjoy her special party." It was exactly the wrong thing to say, and I saw the moment Jake's face fell as he processed his father's words. Because what David had just told him, intentionally or not, was that Rachel's enjoyment of her special party was more important than his desire to have his mother present. That the celebration of his father's new relationship took precedence over his own emotional needs. "But it's supposed to be our family," Jake said, his voice getting smaller and more confused. "And Mommy is part of our family too, isn't she?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no one present could adequately answer, because the truth was complicated and ugly and completely inappropriate for an 8-year-old to have to navigate. The truth was that Jake's family had been restructured around his father's new relationship, and that restructuring required his mother to be positioned as a peripheral figure rather than a central one. Rachel was crying openly now, her perfect makeup streaking down her cheeks as she realized that her engagement party was becoming a very public examination of her role in displacing a child's mother. David looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. And Jake stood in the middle of it all, holding my hand and asking questions that exposed every uncomfortable truth the adults around him had been trying to avoid. The other party guests had begun to gather near the terrace doors, sensing drama but not understanding its source. I could feel their curious gazes and whispered speculations, and I knew that by tomorrow morning, the story of Rachel's engagement party would be spreading through our social circle like wildfire. The story of how the bride-to-be's celebration was derailed by an 8-year-old's innocent questions about why his mother couldn't come home with him. Emma stepped closer to me, her presence both protective and supportive as she surveyed the chaos that had erupted around Jake's simple desire for family unity. "You know what?" she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I think Jake is asking exactly the right questions. Maybe it's time some adults started providing honest answers." And in that moment, standing on that beautiful terrace with the Texas sunset painting everything golden, I realized that my 8-year-old son had just accomplished something I had been too polite and too accommodating to do for myself. He had forced everyone present to confront the reality of what had been done to our family, and he had done it with the kind of innocent honesty that made their carefully constructed justifications crumble like sand. What happened next was something I had never expected to witness. Rachel Williams, the woman who had glided through 2 years of carefully orchestrated family integration with poise and strategic patience, completely unraveled in front of 50 party guests. She pressed her hands to her face as the tears came harder, her shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that suggested months or even years of suppressed anxiety finally breaking free. "I can't do this," she whispered, but her voice carried across the terrace in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the other guests. "I can't be the person who breaks up a family. I never wanted to be that person." She looked at Jake with genuine anguish in her eyes, then at me, then back at David with something approaching desperation. "He's right. He's absolutely right, and I've been lying to myself about it for months." David moved toward Rachel with the kind of panicked energy that meant he was about to lose control of more than just his engagement party. "Rachel, honey, you're upset. Let's go inside and talk about this privately." But Rachel stepped backward, shaking her head with a violence that sent her carefully styled hair tumbling around her shoulders. "No," she said, her voice getting stronger even as the tears continued. "We're not going inside to manage this mess privately, while that little boy stands out here wondering why his world doesn't make sense." He asked a simple question, David. "Why can't his mother come home with him?" And the answer is, because we've created a situation where loving him means erasing her. The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical force. I heard someone gasp, heard David's mother Susan make a small sound of distress, heard my own mother whisper, "Oh my goodness," under her breath. But it was Jake's reaction that mattered most. He was looking at Rachel with the kind of intense focus children reserve for moments when adults suddenly start making sense. "You mean Mommy can't come home because of you?" Jake asked, his 8-year-old brain cutting straight through all the adult complexity to the heart of the matter. It wasn't an accusation, just a clarification, but it landed like a bomb in the middle of Rachel's emotional breakdown. "Not because of me exactly," Rachel said, kneeling down so she was at Jake's eye level, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her cream-colored dress was getting stained by the terrace stones. "Because of choices all the grown-ups made that seemed like good ideas at the time but maybe weren't fair to you or to your mommy." David was staring at his fiancée, with the expression of a man watching his future disintegrate in real time. "Rachel, please, let's not do this here. Let's not make decisions when everyone is emotional and upset." But Rachel wasn't looking at David anymore. She was focused entirely on Jake, as if suddenly seeing him clearly for the first time. "Jake," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "do you understand what's happening here? Your daddy and I are planning to get married, which means I was going to become your stepmother. But being a stepmother should mean I'm an extra person who loves you, not a replacement for your real mother." Jake nodded slowly, processing this explanation with the seriousness he brought to difficult concepts. "So you would be like having 2 mothers who both love me?" "That's exactly what it should be like," Rachel said, and I saw something shift in her expression, some fundamental realignment of her understanding. "But instead, we've been acting like you can only have one mother at a time, and that's not fair to you. It's not fair to your mommy either." Emma moved closer to my side, and I felt her hand squeeze my shoulder as we watched this extraordinary moment unfold. The woman who had been systematically taking over my role in my son's life was publicly acknowledging the harm that had been done, and she was doing it to my son himself, treating him with the honesty that all the adults around him had failed to provide. Mrs. Patterson, Jake's teacher, had arrived at the party during the chaos, invited by David's sister who worked at the school district. She stood near the terrace doors, her professional educator's eye taking in the scene with obvious concern. I saw her exchange a meaningful look with my mother before stepping forward into our circle. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of natural authority that made everyone present turn toward her. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing some of this conversation. As Jake's teacher, I feel like I should mention that he's been struggling with some confusion at school about family relationships." David's face went pale. "What kind of confusion?" Mrs. Patterson glanced at me, then at Rachel, clearly weighing how much to reveal in such a public setting. "Jake has been telling his classmates that he has two mommies, but that one of them doesn't live at his house anymore because she's not as good at being a mommy as the other one. When I tried to clarify the situation with him, he became very upset and said that the grown-ups had told him different things, and he didn't know which ones were true." The silence that followed this revelation was absolutely crushing. Jake had been carrying this confusion and pain to school with him, trying to make sense of adult decisions that no one had bothered to explain properly. Worse, he had internalized the idea that I had been replaced because I was somehow deficient as a mother. "Jake," I said, my voice barely steady, "Baby, is that what you think? That Rachel is better at being a mommy than I am?" Jake looked between Rachel and me with the kind of careful consideration that showed how much thought he had been giving to this question. "Rachel knows how to make the pancakes the right way," he said slowly, "and she doesn't have to go to work meetings when I'm sick. And she's always there when I get home from school. But you give the best hugs, and you remember all my favorite stories, and you never get mad when I ask too many questions." His words were like a knife through my chest because they revealed how he had been forced to create a mental scorecard of maternal qualities, comparing his mother and his soon-to-be stepmother as if they were competing for a job rather than both loving him unconditionally. Rachel's face crumpled as she listened to Jake's analysis. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to touch his cheek, "you should never have to compare us like that. Your mommy isn't less good at being your mother just because I happen to be at the house more often. That's about logistics, not about love." David finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "We never told him Sarah was a bad mother. We've always emphasized that he has two people who love him very much." "But you told him I was his bonus mom," Rachel said, turning to face David with something like accusation in her tear-streaked eyes. "You told him I was an addition to his family, not a replacement. But then you structured everything so that I was doing all the mothering, and Sarah was getting pushed to the margins. You can't have it both ways, David." Marcus stepped forward again, clearly desperate to salvage something from this public disaster. "Look, everyone is emotional right now. Maybe we should table this discussion and let people enjoy the party. We can sort out family logistics later, in private." But Jake, who had been listening to this entire exchange with growing agitation, suddenly spoke up with more force than I had ever heard from him. "I don't want to table it," he said, using Marcus's phrase with the precision that showed he understood its meaning. "I want to know right now why my family is broken, and why no one will fix it." The words came out of my 8-year-old son like a battle cry, and they hit every adult present with the force of absolute truth. His family was broken, not because of divorce, which could be navigated successfully, but because of the way his post-divorce life had been structured to require him to choose between his parents, rather than love them both freely. My father stepped forward then, his face set with the kind of determination I rarely saw from him. "You know what, Jake? You're absolutely right. Your family is broken, and it's time for the grown-ups to figure out how to fix it." He looked directly at David, his voice carrying decades of paternal authority. "Son, I've stayed out of this for 2 years because I wanted to respect your decisions as Jake's father. But watching my grandson suffer because the adults in his life can't figure out how to coexist is where I draw the line." David's jaw tightened. "Bob, I appreciate your concern, but you don't understand the full situation. Sarah and I have been working together to make sure Jake feels loved and supported." "Have you?" my father asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been working together to phase Sarah out of Jake's daily life while maintaining the fiction that she's still an equal parent. That's not co-parenting, David. That's systematic exclusion disguised as cooperation." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw David's friends and family members exchanging uncomfortable glances as they absorbed the implications of what my father had said. Because he was right, and everyone present knew it, even if they hadn't been willing to acknowledge it before this moment. Rachel stood up slowly, her stained dress clinging to her legs as she faced the assembled crowd. "He's right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. "Mr. Mitchell is absolutely right, and I've been complicit in it. I told myself I was just loving Jake and being there for him, but I was actually replacing his mother and pretending it was natural and healthy." The admission sent shockwaves through the party guests. I heard multiple conversations stop mid-sentence as people processed what they were witnessing. Rachel Williams, the perfect future wife and stepmother, was publicly dismantling the narrative that had justified her integration into Jake's life. "Rachel, stop," David said, his voice sharp with panic. "You're being manipulated by emotion right now. You're letting a difficult moment make you question everything we've built together." But Rachel shook her head with growing certainty. "What we've built together is a family structure that requires a child to lose his mother in order for me to feel secure as his stepmother. That's not love, David. That's selfishness disguised as family planning." Jake was watching this exchange with wide eyes, and I could see him trying to process the idea that the adults in his life had been making decisions based on their own needs rather than his best interests. It was a sophisticated concept for an 8-year-old to grasp, but children are remarkably good at sensing when they're being manipulated, even if they can't always articulate how. "So what happens now?" Jake asked, his voice small but determined. "If you know my family is broken, how do we fix it?" It was such a reasonable question, and yet it hung in the air unanswered because none of the adults present had a clear solution. How do you unbreak a family structure that has been carefully constructed over 2 years? How do you restore balance to relationships that have been deliberately imbalanced? How do you explain to a child that the grown-ups in his life need to start over with their approach to loving him? Emma, who had been quietly observing this entire breakdown, finally spoke up. "You know what I think?" she said, addressing Jake directly. "I think you just did something really important. You asked the questions that needed to be asked, and you made all the grown-ups start telling the truth instead of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't." Jake considered this gravely. "So it's good that I made everyone upset?" "Sometimes," Emma said. "Making people upset is the only way to make them pay attention to problems they've been ignoring. And your family definitely had some problems that needed attention." Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further but seeming not to care. "Jake, I need to apologize to you. And to your mommy, too. I came into your life thinking I knew what was best for everyone, but I didn't really think about what was best for you. I thought about what was easiest for me and your daddy." The honesty in her voice was startling, and I found myself looking at Rachel with something approaching respect for the first time since I had met her. It took courage to admit fault in front of 50 people, especially when that admission threatened to derail your engagement and your future family plans. David was looking at Rachel like she had lost her mind. "Rachel, honey, you're having some kind of breakdown. This isn't you talking. This is stress and pressure, and other people's opinions making you doubt yourself." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away from him with a firmness that suggested her mind was becoming clearer, not more confused. "This is exactly me talking," she said. "This is me finally listening to what Jake has been trying to tell us for months. This is me finally seeing what I've been too selfish to notice." She turned to look at me directly, her eyes red, but steady. "Sarah, I owe you an apology that I don't even know how to begin. I convinced myself that I was just loving your son, but I was actually taking over your role and justifying it by telling myself that you weren't around enough to object." The apology hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so unexpected and so complete. I had spent 2 years being diplomatic and understanding while watching this woman systematically replace me in my son's daily life, and now she was acknowledging the harm that had been done with a clarity that was both devastating and vindicating. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying so hard to be the good ex-wife who doesn't cause problems that I forgot I was allowed to advocate for myself and for my relationship with Jake. You shouldn't have had to advocate, Rachel said firmly. Your relationship with your son should have been protected and honored from the beginning. Instead, we made you compete for relevance in his life, and that was cruel and wrong. Jake was following this conversation with the intensity of a child who finally sees adults taking responsibility for their mistakes. Does this mean Mommy can come home with us tonight? He asked, hope creeping into his voice. The question revealed how little he still understood about the complexity of adult relationships. But it also showed what he wanted most: for the people he loved to be able to coexist peacefully in the same space. It was such a simple desire, and yet it had been made impossible by the way his post-divorce family had been structured. Rachel looked at David, then back at Jake, her face showing the weight of a decision that was forming in real time. Jake, sweetheart, I think there are some things the grown-ups need to figure out before we can answer that question. But I want you to know that whatever happens, it's going to be about what's best for you, not about what's easiest for us. David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. Rachel, you're making a huge mistake. You're letting other people's drama destroy what we've built together. Don't throw away our future because of one difficult conversation. But Rachel was shaking her head with growing conviction. David, if our future requires Jake to lose his relationship with his mother, then maybe it's not a future worth having. Maybe we need to figure out how to build something better, something that doesn't require anyone to be sacrificed for our happiness. The words hung in the evening air like a pronouncement of judgment, and I realized that my son's innocent question about why I couldn't come home with him had just changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Because Rachel was right, and everyone present knew it, even David, who was staring at his fiancée with the expression of a man watching his carefully planned world collapse around him, Jake looked around at all the adults surrounding him, their faces showing various combinations of shock, sadness, and something that might have been relief. Are you going to cancel the wedding? He asked with the directness that only children possess. Rachel's laugh was shaky but genuine. I don't know, sweetheart. Right now, I think we need to focus on fixing your family situation before we worry about adding more complications to it. And in that moment, standing on the terrace of the Riverside Country Club, with the last light of sunset fading behind us, I realized that my 8-year-old son had just accomplished something that months of diplomatic co-parenting discussions had failed to achieve. He had forced everyone involved to confront the fundamental unfairness of the situation they had created, and he had done it with the kind of innocent honesty that made all their careful justifications crumble into dust. What happened next would haunt David Chen for the rest of his life, though at the time he was still desperately trying to salvage what remained of his engagement party and his future marriage. He reached for Rachel's hands with the kind of pleading desperation that suggested he was beginning to understand just how much damage Jake's innocent questions had inflicted on his carefully constructed new life. Rachel, please, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that nonetheless carried across the terrace in the sudden stillness. Don't let one difficult moment destroy everything we've planned together. We can work through this. We can figure out better arrangements for everyone. But don't walk away from us because of guilt that isn't even yours to carry. But Rachel was looking at Jake, really looking at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time since she had entered his life 2 years ago. She saw an 8-year-old boy who had been forced to navigate adult complexities that should never have been his burden. She saw a child who had been asking reasonable questions about his family and receiving evasive answers that left him more confused and worried than before. Most importantly, she saw a little boy who loved his mother and couldn't understand why that love had been treated as a problem to be managed rather than a relationship to be celebrated. David, Rachel said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, look at him. Really look at your son. He's been trying to tell us for months that something was wrong with our family arrangement, but we've been so invested in our own version of how things should work that we haven't been listening to him. David did look at Jake then, and I saw something flicker across his face that might have been recognition, or might have been regret. Jake was standing between Rachel and me, still holding my hand, his small face showing the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from trying to please adults whose expectations are fundamentally incompatible. Jake out, David said, kneeling down to his son's level. I need you to know that everything we've done has been because we love you and want you to be happy. If some of our choices haven't worked out the way we hoped, we can change them. We can figure out new ways to do things." Jake considered his father's words with the gravity he brought to all important conversations. "Can you figure out how to make Mommy not sad anymore? Can you figure out how to let me love everyone without having to choose sides?" The questions were so simple and so devastating that I saw several of the party guests look away, unable to witness the moment when a child's clarity exposed the fundamental cruelty of the adults around him. Because that's exactly what Jake had been forced to do: choose sides in a conflict he didn't understand and didn't want to be part of. My mother stepped forward then, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that brooked no argument. "David, that little boy just asked you to stop making him choose between his parents. The fact that he has to ask should tell you everything you need to know about how this situation has been handled." David's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and defensive anger. "Linda, we never asked Jake to choose sides. We've always made it clear that he's loved by everyone." "Actions speak louder than words," my father interjected, his voice calm but implacable. "You can say Jake is loved by everyone all you want, but when you structure his life so that loving one parent means seeing less of the other, you're absolutely making him choose sides." Emma moved closer to my side, her presence both supportive and protective as the conversation continued to spiral into territory that should have been private but had become unavoidably public. "You know what I find interesting," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace, "is that everyone keeps talking about what's best for Jake, but until tonight, no one has actually asked Jake what he wants." All eyes turned to my son, who had been the center of this entire drama, but whose actual preferences had been largely ignored in favor of adult assumptions about what would make him happy. Jake looked around at the circle of grown-ups surrounding him, their faces showing various combinations of expectation and anxiety. "I want my family to be together," Jake said with the kind of straightforward honesty that only children possess. "I want Mommy and Daddy to be friends like they used to be. I want Rachel to be nice to Mommy, instead of pretending she doesn't exist. And I want to stop feeling like I have to lie about who I love, because it might make someone mad." The last statement hit the assembled adults like a physical blow. Jake had been lying about his feelings to protect the grown-ups around him from uncomfortable truths. An 8-year-old child had been managing adult emotions and navigating adult conflicts because the adults themselves had failed to create a safe space for his authentic feelings. Rachel's tears started again, but this time they seemed to come from a place of genuine understanding rather than overwhelming stress. "Jake, you should never have to lie about who you love. Ever. And if we've created a situation where you feel like you have to do that, then we've failed you completely." Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly observing from the edge of our group, stepped forward with the professional confidence that came from years of dealing with complicated family dynamics. "If I may," she said, "as someone who sees Jake every day at school, I can tell you that this confusion and stress has been affecting his academic performance and his social relationships. Children need stability and clarity about their family structure, and Jake has been getting mixed messages for months." David looked stricken. "What kind of mixed messages?" "Well," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "Jake has told his classmates that his real mother doesn't live with him anymore because she's too busy with work to take care of him properly. When I've tried to clarify that divorced parents can both love their children equally, he's become very upset and said that's not what the grown-ups at home have told him." The silence that followed this revelation was absolutely crushing. Jake had been carrying messages about my supposed inadequacy as a mother to school with him, and those messages had come from the adults who were supposed to be protecting his relationship with me. I looked at David, really looked at him, and saw something I hadn't expected to see. Genuine shock and what appeared to be horror as he realized the implications of what Mrs. Patterson had said. "We never told him you were too busy with work," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not directly," Rachel said, her voice thick with tears and self-recrimination. "But I said things like, 'Don't worry, I'll always be here when you get home from school, and your daddy and I will never be too busy for you.' I meant them as reassurances, but Jake interpreted them as criticisms of Sarah. The admission hung in the evening air like an indictment, and I saw David finally begin to understand how their seemingly innocent comments had been poisoning my relationship with my son. Every reassurance Rachel had given Jake about her availability had carried the implicit message that I was unavailable. Every promise about their reliability had suggested that I was unreliable. Jake was watching this adult revelation with the kind of intense focus that showed he was beginning to understand that the grown-ups around him were finally seeing the truth he had been living with for months. "So Mommy isn't bad at being a mother?" he asked, his voice small but hopeful. "Oh, sweetheart," Rachel said, dropping to her knees again and taking Jake's free hand. "Your mommy isn't bad at anything. She's wonderful at being your mother, and we should have been telling you that every single day, instead of making you feel like you had to choose between us." The validation that Jake had been seeking for months finally came, not from his father who had been the architect of this situation, but from the woman who had unknowingly been complicit in undermining his relationship with me. It was a strange kind of justice, but it was justice nonetheless. David was staring at Rachel and Jake with the expression of a man who was finally seeing the true cost of his choices. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and for the first time since our divorce, I heard genuine vulnerability in his voice. "How do I fix this?" "You start by acknowledging that you broke it," my father said bluntly. "You can't fix a problem you won't admit exists, and you've spent 2 years pretending that systematically marginalizing Sarah was somehow in Jake's best interest." David's defensive walls finally crumbled completely. "You're right," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I convinced myself that making things easier for Rachel, and more stable for Jake, was worth the cost of reducing Sarah's role in his life. I told myself that Jake was adjusting well and that Sarah seemed okay with the arrangements, so everyone was getting what they needed. But you never asked what I needed," I said, speaking directly to David for the first time since this entire confrontation had begun. "You never asked if I was okay with seeing my son become a stranger to me. You never asked if I was okay with being treated like a babysitter in my own child's life." The words came out more forcefully than I had intended, carrying 2 years of suppressed frustration and pain. But they needed to be said, and they needed to be heard by everyone present, because this conversation was about more than just immediate family dynamics. It was about the ethics of post-divorce parenting and the responsibility adults have to protect children's relationships with both parents. David met my eyes for the first time in months, and I saw something there that I hadn't seen since our marriage ended: genuine remorse and what appeared to be the beginning of real understanding. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting Jake from conflict, but I was actually creating a different kind of conflict. I was making him feel like loving you meant being disloyal to our new family." Jake looked between his father and me with growing excitement, as if he was beginning to believe that the grown-ups might actually be capable of fixing the problems they had created. "Does this mean we can all be friends again? Does this mean Mommy can come to family things without everyone acting weird?" The question revealed so much about what Jake had been observing and processing. He had noticed the weird behavior, the tension, the way adults acted when I was present at school events or birthday parties. He had been aware of all of it and had been trying to navigate it alone because no one had given him the tools to understand what was happening. Rachel stood up slowly, her stained dress and smeared makeup making her look human and vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. "Jake, I think what it means is that all the grown-ups need to have some serious conversations about how to do better. And I think it means that your mommy and I need to start over and figure out how to both love you without competing with each other." The admission was so far from anything I had expected from this evening that I found myself staring at Rachel in genuine amazement. The woman who had spent 2 years positioning herself as my replacement was now acknowledging that competition had been built into our relationship from the beginning, and she was suggesting that we needed to dismantle that competition in favor of collaboration. "What does that look like practically?" Emma asked, ever the advocate for concrete action rather than abstract promises. Rachel looked at David, then at me, then back at Jake. "It looks like me stepping back from some of the roles I've taken on that rightfully belong to Sarah. It looks like us restructuring our custody arrangement so that Jake spends equal time with both parents. It looks like me learning to be a stepmother instead of a replacement mother." David's face went pale as he absorbed the implications of what Rachel was saying. Rachel, if you step back from your relationship with Jake, if we change our custody arrangement, everything we've built together changes. Our whole life together changes. Maybe it needs to change, Rachel said with growing conviction. Maybe we built our life together on a foundation that was fundamentally unfair to other people, and maybe that's why it feels so unstable now. The conversation had reached a turning point that no one present had anticipated when they arrived at an engagement party expecting to celebrate love and new beginnings. Instead, they were witnessing the dismantling of a family structure that had been built on systematic exclusion and the potential rebuilding of something more ethical and sustainable. Jake, meanwhile, was watching this entire exchange with the kind of hope that children bring to moments when adults finally start making sense. "So you're going to fix it?" he asked. "You're going to make it so I don't have to feel bad about loving Mommy?" "We're going to try," Rachel said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We're going to try very hard to fix it, and we're going to start by listening to you instead of making assumptions about what you want." Marcus, who had been standing at the edge of our group looking increasingly uncomfortable as his friend's engagement party devolved into family therapy, finally spoke up again. "So what happens now? Do we continue with dinner? Do we postpone the celebration? What's the protocol here?" It was a reasonable question that revealed how far we had all traveled from the original purpose of the evening. This had been Rachel's engagement party, her moment to celebrate her upcoming marriage and her integration into David's family. Instead, it had become the moment when that integration was called into question and potentially restructured entirely. Rachel looked around at the 50 guests who had witnessed her very public breakdown and the dismantling of her future family plans. "I think," she said slowly, "that we need to postpone more than just dinner. I think we need to postpone the wedding until we figure out how to do this right." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch every person present. David's face went white, then red, then white again, as he processed what Rachel had just announced to their family and friends. "Rachel, no," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please don't make a decision like that based on one difficult evening. We can work through this without calling off our wedding. We can make adjustments without throwing away our future." But Rachel was shaking her head with the kind of finality that suggested her mind was made up. "David, I love you. I love Jake. But I can't marry into a family that I helped break and pretend that's a foundation for a healthy marriage. We need to figure out how to unbreak Jake's family before we try to expand it." Jake was following this conversation with wide eyes, clearly understanding that something momentous was happening, but not entirely sure what it meant for him. "Are you not going to be my bonus mom anymore?" he asked Rachel, his voice small and worried. "Oh, sweetheart," Rachel said, kneeling down to Jake's level one more time. "I will always love you, and I will always be part of your life if you want me to be, but I think I need to learn how to love you in a way that doesn't hurt your relationship with your real mom." And then something happened that no one had expected. Jake let go of my hand and wrapped his arms around Rachel in a fierce hug. "Thank you for listening to me," he whispered against her shoulder. "Thank you for wanting to fix it instead of pretending it wasn't broken." The hug lasted for several long moments, and when Jake finally pulled back, there were tears in Rachel's eyes again, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than grief. She had found a way to love my son that didn't require his mother to disappear, and Jake had recognized that gift for what it was. "So what happens now?" David asked, his voice hollow with shock and loss. "Now," my mother said with the kind of quiet authority that ended arguments, "everyone goes home and thinks about what Jake said tonight. And then the grown-ups figure out how to put his needs ahead of their own pride and convenience." The party guests began to disperse then, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people processed what they had witnessed. Some looked sympathetic, some looked scandalized, and some looked like they had just witnessed something profound and important, even if they weren't sure exactly what it was. Emma squeezed my shoulder as she prepared to leave. "Call me tomorrow," she said quietly. "We need to talk about what comes next." My parents approached to say goodbye, my father's hand warm and steady on my back. "We're proud of you," he said. You handled this with grace, even when grace wasn't being shown to you. As the terrace emptied, I found myself standing with David, Rachel, and Jake in the gathering darkness. The string quartet had packed up their instruments. The champagne fountain had been turned off. The beautiful engagement party was over, but something else was beginning. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, the first words I had spoken directly to both David and Rachel since this entire evening began. "We start over," Rachel said simply. "We start over and we do it right this time, with Jake's needs at the center instead of our own comfort." David nodded slowly, his face showing the exhaustion of a man whose entire world had shifted in the course of a single evening. "We'll need to talk about custody arrangements. We'll need to talk about school involvement and holiday schedules and how to make sure Jake feels equally loved by everyone. We'll need to talk about a lot of things," I agreed. "But tonight I think Jake just needs to go home and know that the grown-ups in his life are finally going to start working together instead of against each other." Jake looked up at all three of us with something approaching wonder in his dark eyes. "Are we really going to fix it?" he asked one more time, as if he couldn't quite believe that his simple questions had led to such momentous changes. "We're really going to try," I promised him. "And we're going to keep trying until we get it right." As we walked toward the valet stand together, Jake, between David and me, with Rachel walking slightly behind us, I realized that my son had accomplished something extraordinary. He had forced a roomful of adults to confront uncomfortable truths about power and fairness, and the ethics of family building. He had done it with innocence and honesty, and a child's unwavering belief that the people he loved should be able to love each other too. The valet brought David's car around first, and as Jake climbed into his car seat, he looked at me through the window with the kind of peaceful expression I hadn't seen on his face in months. "Mommy," he said, "I think tonight was the best engagement party ever, even though it wasn't really an engagement party anymore." I laughed, the first genuine laugh I had had in months. "Why is that, baby?" "Because everyone finally started telling the truth," Jake said with the wisdom that only children possess. "And when people tell the truth, they can fix things that are broken." As David's car pulled away from the country club, Rachel approached me with hesitation in her every step. "Sarah," she said, "I know I have a lot to make up for. I know saying sorry isn't enough. But I want you to know that I meant what I said tonight. I want to learn how to be part of Jake's life without taking away from your relationship with him." I looked at this woman who had been my adversary for 2 years, who had unknowingly been dismantling my relationship with my son while believing she was building her own family. In her stained dress with her ruined makeup, she looked nothing like the polished figure who had been effortlessly taking over my role as Jake's mother. She looked human and flawed and genuinely committed to doing better. "It's going to be hard," I said honestly, "undoing 2 years of patterns and assumptions and learned behaviors. It's going to be complicated and messy and probably frustrating for everyone involved." Rachel nodded. "I know, but Jake deserves better than what we've given him, and you deserve better than what we've given you. And maybe, if we do this right, we can all have something better than what we had before." As I drove home that night, my mind replaying every moment of the most extraordinary evening of my life, I thought about my son's question that had started it all. "Why didn't you come home with us tonight?" It had been such a simple question, born from a child's desire for family unity, and his confusion about why that unity seemed impossible to achieve. But Jake's question had exposed something that all the adults around him had been trying to ignore. The cost of building new families on the ruins of old ones. The price children pay when adults prioritize their own comfort over ethical co-parenting. The damage that gets done when divorce becomes about winning and losing rather than about creating the healthiest possible environment for the children involved. 3 months later, Jake splits his time equally between David's house and my downtown apartment. Rachel is learning to be a loving stepmother rather than a replacement mother, and she's doing it with a grace and humility that I never expected from her. David and I are learning to be co-parents rather than adversaries. And we're discovering that protecting Jake's relationship with both of us actually makes everyone's life easier rather than harder. The wedding has been postponed indefinitely, while David and Rachel figure out how to build a marriage on a foundation of ethical family integration rather than systematic exclusion. They may eventually marry, or they may not, but either way, they'll make that decision based on what's truly best for everyone involved rather than what's most convenient for them. Jake is thriving in ways that he wasn't before. His teacher reports that his academic performance has improved, and that he no longer seems confused or anxious about family relationships. He talks openly about both his homes, both his parents, and his bonus mom Rachel, without feeling like he has to choose sides or manage adult emotions. And me? I agreed, because that's what I always did. I agreed because I had convinced myself that being the cooperative ex-wife was more important than standing up for my own dignity. I agreed because I thought that somewhere in David's mind, there was still enough respect for our shared history and our child to ensure I wouldn't be completely erased from Jake's life. I was wrong about that too. The day of the engagement party, I spent an hour getting Jake ready. He was excited about wearing his little suit and tie, chattering about how pretty Rachel would look and how there would be cake and dancing. As I drove him to the country club, he asked if I wanted to see Rachel's dress, if I thought she would like the drawing he made for her, if I knew that she and Daddy were going to have a big wedding where he got to carry the rings. Each innocent question felt like a small knife twist, but I smiled and answered enthusiastically because I loved my son and wanted him to be happy, even if his happiness seemed to require my absence. When we arrived at the country club, Jake surprised me by grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the entrance. "Come on, Mommy," he said. "I want to show you where we're going to sit and meet Rachel's family." I tried to explain that this was Daddy's party and I was just dropping him off, but Jake's face fell in that particular way that made my chest ache. "But you're my mommy," he said. "Don't you want to see the party?" Before I could respond, David appeared in the lobby, looking handsome in his navy suit, and slightly panicked at seeing me inside the venue instead of in the car where he'd expected me to stay. "Sarah," he said, forcing a smile, "I didn't expect to see you here." Jake immediately ran to his father and started explaining that he wanted me to see the decorations and meet everyone. David's eyes met mine over Jake's head, and I saw something flicker there, some mixture of guilt and annoyance that made my decision for me. "I'd love to see the party for just a few minutes," I said, matching his forced smile with one of my own. "If that's okay." David couldn't say no without looking like a complete villain in front of our son, so he nodded stiffly and gestured toward the main event space. The party was beautiful in the way that expensive events always are. White roses and golden accents everywhere. A champagne fountain that sparkled in the late afternoon light. Round tables set with crisp linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Jake immediately ran off to find the dessert table, leaving David and me standing awkwardly near the entrance as guests began to notice my presence. I recognized most of the faces from our shared past. David's college friends, his co-workers, both sets of our parents, my own brother Mike, who avoided eye contact when he saw me. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, holding champagne glasses and wearing the kind of forced smiles people wear when they're not sure if they're witnessing a social disaster in real time. Rachel appeared at David's side like she had materialized from thin air, stunning, in a flowing cream-colored dress that managed to look bridal without being white. She was everything I wasn't, tall where I was average height, blonde where I was brunette, effortlessly elegant where I always felt like I was trying too hard. Her smile when she saw me was perfect and cold as winter morning. "Sarah," she said, extending a manicured hand. "What a lovely surprise. I'm so glad you could join us." Over the past 6 months, we had all learned to pay attention when Jake got that particular look on his face, because his observations about our family dynamics were consistently more insightful than anything the adults were producing. "I like that I get to have dinner with Mommy on school nights now," Jake said, his voice clear and confident. "And I like that Rachel doesn't get mad anymore when I talk about things I do with Mommy. But I'm still confused about holidays and stuff. Like, Christmas is coming, and I don't know where I'm supposed to be, or if everyone can be together, or if I have to choose again." The holiday question had been looming over all of us for weeks. It was one thing to restructure custody arrangements and daily routines, but holidays carried emotional weight that made them particularly challenging to navigate. Traditional post-divorce wisdom suggested alternating years or splitting days. But Jake's question at the engagement party had made it clear that he wanted inclusion rather than division. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We've been talking about that, buddy. We want to make sure you get to celebrate with everyone who loves you, but we also want to make sure the grown-ups can handle being together for longer periods without anyone getting stressed or upset." "But you guys don't get upset anymore," Jake pointed out with the logic that only children possess. "You talk to each other like normal people now, and Rachel says nice things about Mommy instead of pretending she doesn't exist. So why can't we all just have Christmas together like a regular family?" Dr. Vasquez leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over her notepad. "Jake, when you say like a regular family, what does that look like in your mind?" Jake considered the question seriously, his face scrunched up in concentration. "Like, everyone comes to Christmas morning at the same house, and we open presents together, and no one has to leave halfway through to go to their other family. And everyone helps make breakfast, and we watch movies together, and it's not weird or tense or anything." The simplicity of his vision was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Jake wanted what every child wants during the holidays, to be surrounded by all the people who love him without having to worry about adult conflicts or complicated logistics. It was such a reasonable desire, and yet it required a level of emotional maturity and collaboration from the adults that most divorced families never achieved. Rachel spoke up then, her voice careful and measured. "Jake, I think that sounds wonderful, and I want you to know that I'm willing to try to make that happen. But I also want to make sure your mommy feels comfortable with that arrangement, because her feelings matter too." It was a small moment, but significant in the context of our journey. 6 months ago, Rachel would never have deferred to my comfort level or acknowledged that my feelings were relevant to family decisions. The transformation in her approach to co-parenting had been remarkable to witness, even when it was sometimes painful for all of us. I took a breath before responding, knowing that what I said next would set the tone for how we handled not just Christmas but every major family event going forward. "I think Jake's idea sounds lovely," I said slowly, "and I appreciate Rachel asking about my comfort level. The truth is, I want to be able to celebrate holidays with my son without it being a source of stress for anyone. If we can all commit to making it work, then I'm willing to try." David's face showed a mixture of relief and apprehension. "What would that look like practically? Whose house? What about extended family? What about traditions that Rachel and I have started versus traditions that Jake remembers from when we were all together?" Dr. Vasquez intervened before the conversation could spiral into logistics anxiety. "Let's take this one step at a time. David, your question about traditions is interesting. Jake, do you have thoughts about which traditions are important to you?" Jake lit up at the question. "I want to keep making the special pancakes on Christmas morning like Mommy used to make when we all lived together. And I want to keep the thing where we each get to open one present on Christmas Eve. But I also like the hot chocolate bar that Rachel made last year, and the way she lets me help wrap all the presents." His answer revealed something that the adults had been too caught up in their own conflicts to notice. Jake didn't see traditions as belonging to one parent or the other. He saw them as belonging to his family, and he wanted to preserve the good things from every iteration of that family, while adding new elements that made everyone feel included. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "Jake, I love that you want to keep all those traditions. And I want you to know that the pancakes your mommy makes are way better than anything I could make, so I would be honored if she would teach me how to make them too." The offer was so genuine and so far from the territorial behavior that had characterized our early interactions that I found myself smiling despite the emotional intensity of the conversation. "I'd be happy to share the recipe," I said. "It was actually my grandmother's recipe originally, so it would be nice to know it's being passed down to another generation." Jake bounced slightly in his seat with excitement. "So we can really all have Christmas together? Like for real this time?" "We can try," David said, his voice carrying a note of wonder as if he was surprised to hear himself agreeing to something he would have considered impossible 6 months earlier. "We'll need to talk through the details and make sure everyone knows what to expect, but yes, we can try." Dr. Vasquez made a note on her pad before looking up at our little group. I want to acknowledge something important that just happened here. Jake expressed a need, and instead of immediately explaining why it couldn't work, all three adults worked together to figure out how it could work. That's a significant shift from the patterns you described when we first started meeting. She was right, and the shift had been hard-won through months of difficult conversations and painful realizations. The version of our family that existed now bore little resemblance to the dysfunctional dynamic that had led to Jake's devastating question at the engagement party. We had learned to prioritize his emotional well-being over our own convenience, and the results were visible in everything from his improved grades, to his more relaxed demeanor, to his willingness to express his needs directly rather than trying to manage adult emotions. "There's something else I want to talk about," Jake said, his voice taking on the serious tone that meant he was about to broach a difficult topic. "I want to know what's happening with the wedding. Like, are Rachel and Daddy still getting married? Are we still going to be a family? I don't want things to go back to how they were before, but I also don't want Rachel to go away." The question we had all been avoiding had finally been asked directly, and I could see the anxiety in both David's and Rachel's faces as they realized they would have to provide Jake with an honest answer about their relationship status. Rachel reached over and took Jake's hand gently. "Jake, that's such an important question, and I'm glad you feel safe enough to ask it. The truth is that your daddy and I are taking things slowly and figuring out what kind of relationship works best for our family. We love each other, and we both love you, but we want to make sure that if we do get married, it's for the right reasons and in the right way." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "What are the right reasons?" David answered this time, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. "The right reasons are that we want to build a family that makes everyone feel loved and included and secure. The wrong reasons would be if we got married just because we planned to, or because we were afraid of change, or because we thought it would be easier than figuring out how to co-parent well. So you might get married, or you might not, but either way, you're going to keep being good to each other and good to me and good to Mommy?" Jake asked, seeking clarification with the precision of a child who had learned not to take adult promises at face value. "That's exactly right," Rachel said firmly. "No matter what happens between your daddy and me romantically, we're committed to being a family that works for everyone, especially you." Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Jake, how does that answer sit with you?" Jake was quiet for a moment, processing the information with the careful consideration he brought to all important decisions. "I think it sounds good," he said finally. "I like that you're being honest with me instead of pretending you know what's going to happen when you don't. And I like that no matter what, nobody's going away, and nobody's going to be mean to anybody else." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from school pickup logistics to summer vacation planning to how we would handle Jake's future extracurricular activities. By the time we left Dr. Vasquez's office, we had a comprehensive plan for managing the next 6 months of our evolving family structure, complete with contingencies for various scenarios and regular check-ins to make sure everyone's needs were being met. As we walked to our cars in the parking lot, Jake skipped ahead of the adults, his energy high and his mood obviously improved by the clarity he had gained during the session. David and Rachel walked together, their hands loosely clasped, while I followed a few steps behind, giving them space while remaining part of the group. "Sarah," Rachel said suddenly, turning to face me as we reached our vehicles, "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for being willing to work with us on rebuilding this family. I know it would have been easier for you to just fight for more custody time and shut us out, but you chose collaboration instead, and Jake is so much better off because of that choice." The acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected it to. For 2 years, I had felt like the villain in their love story, the bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept her diminished role gracefully. To hear Rachel recognize that I had chosen the harder path of collaboration over the simpler path of conflict was validation I hadn't realized I needed. "Thank you for being willing to change," I replied honestly. "It would have been easier for you to dig in and defend the status quo, but you chose to listen to Jake and admit when things weren't working. That took real courage." David had been listening to this exchange with an expression of amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe that the two women who had been locked in an unspoken competition for his son's primary affection were now genuinely complimenting each other's parenting choices. "You know," he said slowly, "I think Jake was right that night at the engagement party. He said we needed to fix our family, and I thought he was being dramatic. But we really did need to fix it, and somehow we actually managed to do it." Jake, who had been examining something fascinating on the ground near his father's car, looked up at the sound of his name. "Are you talking about how I fixed everything by asking the right questions?" he asked, with the kind of innocent pride that made all three adults smile. "You absolutely did fix everything by asking the right questions," I told him. "You were braver than any of the grown-ups, and you never gave up on believing that our family could be better." Jake beamed at the praise, then looked around at the three adults who had spent the past 6 months learning how to put his needs ahead of their own egos. "I'm proud of you guys too," he said generously. "You were really bad at being a family before, but you got much better at it." The assessment was so matter-of-fact and so accurate that all three of us burst into laughter. Jake had developed a gift for cutting through adult complexity to the essential truth of any situation, and his observation that we had simply gotten better at being a family was both humble and profound. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in David and Rachel's kitchen at 7 o'clock on Christmas morning, wearing pajamas and a robe, helping Rachel master my grandmother's pancake recipe while Jake supervised from his perch on a bar stool, and David managed the bacon and coffee. It was surreal and wonderful and occasionally awkward, but it was exactly what Jake had asked for that day in Dr. Vasquez's office. The hot chocolate bar that Rachel had insisted on setting up was elaborate and beautiful, with marshmallows in 4 different flavors and enough toppings to stock a small cafe. Jake moved between helping me measure flour and helping Rachel arrange candy canes, completely in his element as the center of attention from 3 adults who were all genuinely focused on making his Christmas morning perfect. "Mommy," Jake said as I poured batter onto the griddle, "do you think other kids whose parents are divorced get to have Christmas like this?" It was such a Jake question, simultaneously innocent and insightful, and it made me pause to consider how unusual our arrangement really was. Most divorced families I knew operated on strict schedules, with clear boundaries, trading children back and forth like packages, rather than finding ways to celebrate together. "Probably not many," I admitted. "Most divorced families have to take turns with holidays. But most divorced families probably don't have kids who are brave enough to ask for what they really want." Jake considered this seriously. "Maybe I should tell my friends at school that they can ask for what they want too. Maybe their families could figure out how to have Christmas together if the kids ask the right questions." Rachel looked up from her marshmallow, arranging with tears in her eyes. "Jake, you might be onto something there. Maybe lots of families could be happier if the kids felt safe enough to say what they really needed." David flipped a piece of bacon with perhaps more force than necessary, his jaw tight with emotion. "I still can't believe how close we came to getting this completely wrong," he said quietly. "If Jake hadn't spoken up that night at the party, we might have spent years making him choose between us without ever realizing how much it was hurting him." "But he did speak up," I pointed out, sliding the first batch of pancakes onto a warming plate. "And we did listen eventually. That's what matters now." The morning continued with present opening that felt surprisingly natural despite the unconventional family configuration. Jake moved between his 3 adults with easy affection, sharing his excitement over each gift and making sure everyone felt included in his joy. Rachel and I exchanged small gifts, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier but now felt appropriate and comfortable. By the time we sat down for our elaborate Christmas brunch, we had established a rhythm that worked for everyone. David and Rachel sat together as the couple they were trying to figure out how to be, while I sat across from them as the co-parent who was no longer competing for relevance in her own child's life. Jake moved freely between all 3 adults, completely comfortable with the arrangement because it met his needs for inclusion and stability. "You know what?" Jake announced as he cut into his second pancake, "This is exactly what I wanted. This is exactly what I asked for." And it was. Not perfect, not without its moments of awkwardness or uncertainty, but exactly what our 8-year-old family architect had requested. A Christmas morning where everyone he loved could be together without conflict or competition. where adults prioritized his happiness over their own discomfort, where love multiplied rather than divided. As we cleaned up the kitchen together later that morning, Rachel and I working side by side while David and Jake assembled a particularly complex Lego set in the living room, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. From that devastating evening at the country club when Jake's innocent question had exposed all our failures, through months of difficult therapy sessions and painful realizations, to this moment of genuine collaboration and shared joy. "Sarah," Rachel said quietly as we loaded the dishwasher, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me completely? For the way I handled things in the beginning? For how I took over without thinking about what it was costing you and Jake?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought about forgiveness, but because I had been so focused on moving forward that I hadn't taken time to examine my own emotional process around letting go of past hurts. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm already in the process of forgiving you. Not because what happened was okay, but because you've shown me through your actions that you understand why it was wrong and you're committed to doing better. That matters more to me than apologies." Rachel nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want you to know that I think about it every day. How different Jake's life could have been if I had approached things differently from the beginning. How much easier it could have been for all of us if I had seen you as an ally instead of competition." "We can't change the past," I said, echoing something Dr. Vasquez had said to us many times over the past months. "But we can choose how we move forward from here. And I think we're choosing well." Later that afternoon, as I prepared to leave for my parents' house, where we would continue the holiday celebration, Jake gave me one of his fierce hugs and whispered in my ear, "Thank you for not giving up on our family, Mommy. Thank you for helping everyone learn how to be better." The words stayed with me as I drove across town, thinking about how much had changed since that night when Jake's simple question had forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths about the family structure we had created. We had learned that love doesn't have to be rationed or divided, that children can handle complex family arrangements as long as the adults are honest and collaborative, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that your approach isn't working and be willing to try something different. 3 months later, in March, David and Rachel quietly announced that they had decided to postpone their wedding indefinitely while they focused on building a strong foundation for their relationship and their blended family. The decision was mutual and came without drama or recrimination, simply a recognition that they needed more time to figure out how to be partners in a way that honored everyone's needs. Jake took the news with the equanimity he had developed over our months of honest communication. "So you're still together, but you're not getting married right now?" He asked for clarification. "That's right," David confirmed. "We want to make sure that when we do get married, if we do, it's because it makes our family stronger, not because it's what we plan to do." "That makes sense," Jake said, with a wisdom that continued to amaze me. "It's like how I had to learn how to be a good friend to Tommy before we could be best friends. You have to learn how to be good at being a family before you can be good at being married." The analogy was perfect, and revealed how much Jake had internalized the lessons we had all been learning about the importance of building relationships on solid foundations, rather than rushing toward predetermined outcomes. By the time summer arrived, our new family rhythm had become second nature. Jake spent equal time at both houses, with all 3 adults actively involved in his school activities, friendships, and extracurricular interests. We attended his baseball games together, collaborated on birthday party planning, and even managed a successful joint vacation to the beach, where we rented adjacent condos and spent a week proving to ourselves that our new dynamic was sustainable even under the stress of extended togetherness. The transformation in Jake was remarkable. His teachers commented on his improved focus and confidence. His friends' parents noted how comfortable he seemed talking about his family situation. Most importantly, he had stopped carrying the weight of adult emotions and had returned to the business of being a child who felt secure in the love of all his adults. One evening in late July, as I tucked Jake into bed at my apartment, he asked me a question that brought our journey full circle. "Mommy, do you remember that night at Rachel's party when I asked why you couldn't come home with us?" "I remember," I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. I'm glad I asked that question, even though it made everyone upset. Because now I know that sometimes you have to make people upset in order to make things better. That's a very wise thing to understand, I told him. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still important to tell it. Jake nodded sleepily. I think our family is much better now. Even though it's different than I thought it would be, it's better because everyone gets to be honest, and no one has to pretend anymore. As I turned off his light and headed toward my own bedroom, I reflected on my son's observation. Our family was indeed much better, not because it looked like anything we had originally planned, but because it had been built on honesty and collaboration, rather than competition and exclusion. Jake's innocent question that night at the engagement party had seemed like a moment of devastating exposure, revealing the flaws in our carefully constructed family narrative. But it had actually been a moment of liberation, freeing all of us from unsustainable patterns and giving us permission to build something better. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest questions, asked by the people who love us enough to demand honesty even when honesty is inconvenient. My 8-year-old son had taught me that courage doesn't always look like dramatic gestures or grand confrontations. Sometimes it looks like a child asking why his mother can't come home with him, and then refusing to accept adult explanations that don't actually make sense. The question that had initially felt like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far better than any of us had imagined possible. And in the end, that was the greatest gift Jake could have given to all of us. The chance to love him honestly, without conditions or competitions, in a family structure that honored everyone's needs, rather than requiring anyone to be sacrificed for someone else's happiness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.